All right, everyone, we're ready to get started. Welcome to this webinar on creating podcasts in class. I am Monica Brady-Meyerov, and I'm joined today by Michael Godsey, who is an English language arts teacher from California. And I hope that you'll continue.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Michael. Sorry, Michael. And I hope you all will continue to introduce yourselves in the chat box. So let me go to the first slide where we can talk a little bit more about who I am, who Michael is, what we're going to hear in this webinar. And if you're just joining us, please remember to mute yourselves so that we don't get any reverberations with the sound. So as I said, I'm Monica Brady-Meyerov. I'm the CEO and founder of ListenWise, and we are a listening skills building company that is free for teachers. So we curate public radio, stories, and podcasts for your classroom. And we'll be telling you a little more about that in there, but you can go to listenwise.com and sign up for free today. It'll always be free. And you'll even get yourselves a free trial of Premium, which is our digital solution for schools and districts that you can try out. And today I'm thrilled to be joined by Michael Godsey, an ELA teacher and ListenWise user from California. Thank you, everyone, today for joining us to learn more about how to podcast in your classroom. Michael has a lot of experience doing it in the classroom, and I am a 20-year veteran of public radio, so I have a lot of experience writing and producing podcasts for public radio. So a couple of housekeeping items before we start. You're already introducing yourselves in the chat box. That's great. Keep doing that. And as we're presenting, please feel free to share comments and questions throughout the webinar. And Michael and I will answer all of them at the end of the webinar. Just a reminder to keep your audio on mute. And we've also posted the dial-in number in the chat box if you have any audio troubles throughout the half hour. So let's get started. How are podcasts relevant in classroom instruction? Well, they address many Common Core Anchor standards of speaking and listening. They help students integrate and evaluate information presented in diverse media formats, including visually, quantitatively, and orally. And they also can help students evaluate a speaker's point of view, reasoning, use of evidence. Basically, it helps students think at a different level. Then we're going to be also looking at how does creating media facilitate learning at a deeper level and how to do that. So in the end of the podcast, you're also going to learn more specifically from Mike, especially about how can I help my students make a podcast. This is where we're going to think through some sample podcast lessons, and we're going to hear some podcasts from students and how one might go about creating a podcast lesson for your students. We'll be giving you a playbook and the tools you need to make podcasts. Many of them are free or at a low cost. So to kick it off, I really want to talk first about just audio and why should we teach with audio stories? How are these podcasts relevant in classroom instruction? Well, as I just mentioned, for one thing, they can really make a social and emotional connection for the students. That they can help evaluate a speaker's point of view. They can connect to that person who's speaking in an emotional and social way because of the audio of their voice. So podcasting can help support this important 21st century skills around communication, critical thinking, creativity, and collaboration. But also listening is really increases the pathway to empathy. It is a pathway to empathy. In fact, multiple studies have shown that when you listen to a person's voice, your empathy increases. And that also when you listen to a story as a group, the entire group feels well bonded and empathy increases. And that's because hearing a person speak in their own words with emotion, it builds a social connection. So the stories on ListenWise help students get exposed to this and really help them develop empathy, which is much harder to do through traditional texts such as reading. Why else should you teach with audio? Well, it is a great way to build up in vocabulary and improve literacy. Listening is the foundation for reading comprehension, and reading comprehension and listening comprehension are closely tied. So you may not know this, but students can listen 2 to 3 grade levels higher than they can read. So that means using audio to teach can stretch their vocabulary. Repeated listening also will help them repeated listening with the transcript, which ListenWise Premium provides, an in-sync transcript with the audio, helps students improve their reading. That's what studies have shown. As I said, that listening comprehension and reading comprehension are tightly tied. And when you add the subtitles with the audio, that increases your literacy skills. And finally, listening is great for everyone. It's a great equalizer. The resources are typically short. You can have repeated listening and have increased exposure to stories, to topics that you're listening to, and it supports all learners. So an English language learner, let's say, could get particular supports on our website that help them grasp the understanding of the story so that they are working together with the entire classroom. So with audio stories, the entire class can listen to the same story regardless of reading level, and we can have great classroom discussions about content and concepts. And Michael, I'd love to hear your take on using these audio stories in your classroom, even before you introduce the concept of your students making the podcasts.
Yeah, sure. I've read the studies and it tickles my brain, but I just can only say what I've seen in my class, and the empathy is just obvious. That's probably the best thing I love about using the stories is that I can watch their reactions, and I can see the whole class go, oh, or laugh at the same time and know that we're all on the same page. And it's kind of, it spreads, the rest of the class knows that the rest of the class is engaged, and we get into the character. We listen to Serial, and very likely that Adnan did something, that he's guilty of something, and yet he's such a sympathetic character. They get into it. And we've listened to other podcasts, and it's so good to see them into that character. And
so you can see them all having a group experience. And actually, in fact,
right.
in public radio, we would call this often a driveway moment. It means
right.
that you love listening to NPR and you drive home and you're sitting in your own driveway and you can't get out of the car because you have to hear the end of the story. You are in that story. You are experiencing that story. And so in public radio, when I was a reporter, we called it the driveway moment. But there's actually a research term that explains this concept and explains what's happening in your classroom, Mike, is that it's called the immersed experience view. And it means that understanding language is akin in some way to actually being there and experiencing the events the language describes. So the evidence shows that people are simulating what it would like to be in a scene. And that makes sense when you think about all the neuroscience. When your brain is listening, it's lit up in so many more areas than if you're reading or watching a movie. Your brain is making a movie. And so it's an extremely visual medium. And I think that's what pulls in your students and really connects them to audio stories. But now I'm going to turn it over to you, Mike, and we can talk about how going from just listening to great stories, which, as I said, you can do on listenwise.com, now to how do you make your great stories with your students?
Sure. And I'm going to confess something. This was completely accidental. This was season 2 of Serial. They provided the transcript, so I put it up on the screen and said, they're there if you want them. And I obviously didn't think they were going to read them voluntarily when they could just listen to it. And they all looked up at the screen. And when I was a little slow and scrolling down, they got upset with me. And I was like, whoa, maybe I'm onto something. And I talked to a teacher at another charter school that helps struggling students, dropouts, basically. And he said the same thing, that they had the Chromebooks and the scripts, and they couldn't help but read. And it's such a game changer.
Well, we have a clip here too. Yeah, I don't want to cut you off, but I know we have a clip about this from you. This was from a Mindshift podcast where the reporter interviewed some of your students to talk about how this transcript helped them better understand the story. So why don't I play that right now, and then you can talk more about it after we hear this short clip.
Hearing a podcast is different from reading a book out loud or to yourself.
You kind of read it and you hear it in your mind, but as your voice. It's cool to hear it from them on a podcast because it's them, and it's them with their emotions and stuff.
Godsey accidentally discovered another benefit to projecting the text on the board. He can watch his students' faces and see how engaged they are. He can see how they respond while absorbing the story's text, word choices, sentence structure, and spelling. such as the word Afghanistan. Here's Jose again.
I thought there was a T in it, so I'd say Afghanistan with a T. It's always on the news, and I usually watch more Spanish news than I do American news. And so the way they pronounced it, it'd be like, for example, it'd be like, oh, in Afghanistan cayó una bomba, stuff like that. And so I get it how like they pronounce it in Spanish, and instead of trying to correct myself in English, I just say like the Spanish way, you know? Reading the board and listening to a podcast, actually, I saw improvements in my pronunciation and words because reading the words on the board and listening to how it was pronounced actually helped me a lot.
So we'll stop that there, but it's just a great example of how first listening to these awesome high quality audio stories, it's a great way to start your podcast lessons, right, Mike?
Oh yeah, absolutely. They right, listening to them to the podcast gives them an idea of the podcast, but talking more about just a little bit about the transcripts, I don't get my students ever to talk about learning, like how they, like what Jose was just doing there, except in this case. I try to get them to, but to talk about, wow, this is helping my reading is really just a huge deal. And I can't see them read in any other way. Either I'm reading to them and I can't look at them, or they're reading quietly and I don't exactly know where they're at. So to watch them engage and to see where they're struggling, and all the studies that show that they can do this 3 grade levels ahead with the podcast, that's what I see in my class, that they can take so much more when they're looking at the podcast. So you were asking about making podcasts. This is where I start. We start with analyzing and looking at just getting a wide range of podcasts from life. So we listen to Serial, we listen to This American Life, we listen to This and ListenWise. We try all different kinds so we can see what's normal. That's the start. How do they build them, and then we go from there.
Yeah, and then I think the next, as you're listening to these podcasts, you can point out the different types of style. So public radio has a style of reporting. It's different from commercial radio. It's different from having a couple people talk about a subject. And there, you can choose the style you want your podcast to be in, that your students to do. And there's also ways that you produce it that provides time for music or voices. There are lots of elements of natural sound and music that could enhance the storytelling. And you get to be the teacher and really giving the students permission to choose how would they like to tell the story. So Mike, I'm curious, when you're starting off a podcasting creation lesson, do you set the parameters around that, or do you let the students choose?
I give them kind of both. I give them a choice of parameters. So we listen to a podcast in which it's more like the news, like you're describing, and then there's like Serial, which is more of a narrative. And then we listen to a couple that are more like radio talk show, even though it's a podcast, and talk about the technical form of those and what's expected out of those. But they build that themselves. Why did this podcast work? Or why did it not work? We talk about that too. Why did they not like that one? And I don't know if we're gonna have a clip of that or not, but just yesterday, four of my boys in the class did a podcast pretty much exactly like a sports podcast they heard, except they did it on Holden Caulfield.
That's great. We're going to play that. Yeah, we'll play that just a little later near the end. It is a great example of how what your students are modeling is a discussion. And you're right. It's as if they're talking about a sports game, not a book. It's fascinating to hear. But, one of the things I always... Sorry?
Oh, I was going to say, but I realized we failed when we didn't look at those forms. When I just said, now I'm embarrassed to say, like the very first year was, record yourself doing a podcast. And those really failed. They need some structure. They can have a choice of structures, but to analyze forms and structures ahead of time is really essential.
And I would add that it would be helpful for you as the teacher to also break them into groups and assign the topics, or give them a choice of 1 or 2 topics. I facilitated a lot of teachers creating podcasts, and this works well. So it's typically better done in a group of 2 to 3 students. You give them one topic, or one topic that they can take a different approach to, and then assign the roles in the group. Either you assign them or they self-assign Now, these are the mechanical roles about who's going to record, who's going to do the primary writing, who will edit. You'll all be doing them together, really, but there are some students who just feel more comfortable around the sound editing or the recording, and others who want to be the voice on the podcast. So it just helps at the very beginning to relieve a lot of tension and stress around like who's doing what in this podcast. They're all creating it together, but there's so many different elements that go into it. It's helpful to clarify those roles. Mike, what is that how you roll it out in your class as well?
Yeah, I found that it took me a while to realize this, but some students get really stressed out when they don't have structure. When they're just given ultimate freedom, they freak out. And so assigning an assortment of topics or just one topic, the last one I did was discussing Holden Caulfield, really relaxes them. And then some of them are really stressed out by hearing their voice or working with technology. And if you want your kids engaged, what I've found is finding that role, exactly what you said. Some students are excited about recording. Some students are excited about speaking and getting into it. And then there's a couple that really love doing the editing. Like they love it. And all of a sudden they're completely engaged in the class. And you don't want to pigeonhole them so they don't learn anything else. But that you get some really, really engaged teams that way.
Yeah, it's great to watch them. Students blossom into roles that you might not have thought they'd take. So some students I've heard who are terrified to stand in front of the class and present want to be the ones to record their voices on a podcast. But now to go through the actual podcasting process. So this list I'm sending you, we're going to email you the details in a podcasting PDF. But this is the way I worked on a podcast project with a science teacher, an 8th grade science teacher. And it was a pretty rigorous podcast that included reaching out to real scientists to do the interviews with them. So the way that the science teacher put it together was that they were all working on sediment coring and carbon dating in mud. So it was a pretty intense science topic, and they had to do a lot of research about it. And then the team would have to summarize that research and discuss it, looking online and deciding who they wanted to interview about the topic. And once they identified a scientist, the teacher reached out via email to the scientists. And what's so amazing about podcasting is that it's so easy to record your voice on your telephone or on your iPhone or cell phone and send it over on the internet that pretty much any researcher or grad student or somebody in the community outside your 4 walls would probably be happy to be interviewed for your podcast. But you want to follow a very strict process so that the students are really researched what they're going to be asking this person. What are the questions, narrowing it down. Like you can generate a list of 10, but only ask two or 3 on the actual recorded interview because you don't want to end up with a lot of tape of this interview that's very hard to manage and edit. But once you get that, so in the case of the scientist podcast, the teacher emailed the research scientist in the field questions. The researcher recorded the answers on their smartphone and emailed them back to the teacher. So there was no interaction between the outside person and the students. The teacher was the go-between, but it allowed them to get real answers from a real scientist. Then that team had to listen to those responses, write out verbatim the transcript. This is an important part of the podcasting process, is you need to write out everything that you're going to be recording. And they had to summarize it, and they had to work on creating a script around it. And once they created the script around it, they then were able to record it and add in the clips from the research scientist and edit it all together. So it's something that is, it takes through a lot of different Common Core standards you're hitting there with reading and or writing and summarizing and working together online. And I know this approach is a little different probably than what Michael has done in his class, where I believe you said your podcasts have been more conversational. Is that correct?
We've done, like I said, we've done a variety of forms. We've done Tell a Story. We mimicked Serial. And then the last one we did was more conversational. One that you haven't heard that we did also yesterday was an interview. I'll talk a little bit more about that 2 students interviewed somebody about Holden Caulfield. And they were so happy when that was all done. They really enjoyed that format.
Great. Just a couple other tips on when you're recording something. You want the students to pay attention to trying to get good audio, but this is not going to be a project that's going to be graded on the audio quality. It's really, think more about how to grade your students and help your students to learn through the process of this podcast creation. But you can walk them through that they want to be close to the microphone when they're recording, so it's clear and in a quiet place, and that it's well edited. They can edit out the pickups and the retakes, that it's creative, and that maybe they are adding music if it makes sense to in the flow of the story. So just to talk for a minute about the tools, what's great about this moment in time is that there's so many awesome recording tools and editing tools, and many of them are free. So this is a list of some of them, and we'll be adding links to many of these, I believe, in our chat box. But if you have iPads in your classroom, GarageBand comes with it. If you don't, Audacity is a free audio editing software. It's a little clunky, but it works great. Or Soundtrap is a newer fee-based editing software that's really easy to use. It's pretty low cost, and they have school and district licenses. That's to edit your sound. To record your sound, really, there's so many tools on your smartphone and also on your computer. And we, again, are going to put all the links are in the free podcasting guides that you will all be receiving in an email. So don't worry about not knowing where to find these. We're going to send you all the information. So, Mike, which one of these tools do you use with your class?
So I think it depends on what you're doing. We've used Audacity for one of them, and the kid that loved editing, that's where he wanted to go with that, and that was awesome. I learned a lot through that. Soundtrap, was brand new to us. It's kind of like if you've used Google Docs, but for podcasting. The great thing about that was like a shared thing. And so a group could do a podcast, but they can do it on 3 different computers. And in fact, somebody could, for homework, edit it by himself or herself. And they really like that. And it's very music-based. So there's a lot of easy ways to drop in music and sounds. So in that way, it was really cool. And it wasn't as complicated as Audacity, which is good and bad. But the sharing part of it was neat. And then, like I'll talk about a little bit later, just the easy ones is sometimes the kids just record it on their phone, and they record it and upload it pretty fast. Some of these kids know what they're doing real quick. So.
Well, let's jump ahead because I want to get to this classroom podcasting example and play a little bit of your class imitating Serial. Why don't you set that up? Because I have to go over to another screen here to pull up the audio. So, Michael, tell us about what we're going to be hearing.
Sure. So what we were doing was listening to season 1 of Serial. It's the most popular thing we do in class. They get fully engaged in it. We analyze the form. We analyze everything that Sarah Koenig's doing as a narrator, as a storyteller, and as a podcast. We note when she pauses and when she stops and when she includes music. And then we try to, the assignment is to apply it to something else that we've read, either recently or we read right after that. So we've done it with The Crucible. And so it was like a mystery about the witch hunt. And that worked really well for comprehension of The Crucible. But I wasn't at that time very good at the production of podcasts. So the podcast itself was kind of a disaster, but it was a great learning tool. And then this one that we'll listen to is The Stranger, which is great because there was a murder and a court case. And what I was trying to teach was how to apply one form to something else. So this is just copying her form almost exactly. It's almost a satire. In fact, in some ways it is a satire. They're kind of making a few jokes there. And so they can show that they understand the form of Serial, but also the story of The Stranger. So,
all right, here we go.
This is a Globotel Link prepaid call from
The Stranger,
an inmate at a Morro Bay Correctional Facility.
From This Californian Life and MBHS, it's Stranger Serial, one story told week by week. I'm Shelby. For the last week, I've spent every working day trying to figure out what a man was thinking on one hot day in 1942. Or if you want to get technical about it, and apparently I do, what a man was thinking for one single minute on a hot day in 1942. This search sometimes feels undignified. On my part, I've had to ask about his sex life, his sketchy friends, his drinking habits, his relationship with his parents.
And I'm not a detective or a private investigator. I'm not even a crime reporter. But yes, every day this year I've tried to figure out the motive of a strange, strange man. Before I
So I'm going to stop it there, Michael, and say
Yeah.
we're going to provide the clip for you in the chat box. So look for it there so you can listen to the whole thing because it's really fantastic. And if you haven't listened to Serial podcast itself, go listen to that as well because then you'll get how brilliant this is with your students imitating a format, but using all they know, using their knowledge about the stranger. It's just such a great way to bring two really creative things together.
Yeah, and the talks are great. The product is fine too, but I was there when they were talking about it, and to have one student or a few students write it and then explain to her how they want it read and when to pause and do they have the right words? Is it really true to the book? Those discussions are the best that I have in any class. And usually they're struggling students that pass the class to begin with, and all of a sudden now they're engaged in talking about production of media, but also the literature reading. And that's what you don't see, but that I really love.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue to talking about student outcomes because I think in doing podcasts, it's such there's just so much deep learning going on because you're having a repeating deep content understanding where you're discussing it as a group and one person's reading it, another is listening, another is editing. So they are going back to the same content over and over again. And you can differentiate the instruction because as we said, some students are good at one part of the podcast creation, some are good at the other, but they're all absorbing the same content at the same time. And this touches multiple Common Core standards. And these quotes are taken from your students there, Mike. And I have the audio here of this Holden Caulfield discussion, which I think is great. And I'm wondering, did the students write a script before they had this conversation, or were they just sort of riffing on it? Because I'll play about a minute of it, but I just want to hear the genesis of this. Wait, go ahead and tell me. Okay, well, let's play it, and then you can tell me the genesis of this conversation.
Oh, okay, yeah, I thought I was waiting.
Welcome to our podcast. This is Mr. Godsey's 4th period English, and we're here to spit some knowledge.
We're going to tell you why everyone needs to read The Catcher in the Rye when they're a teenager. It's an amazing book.
We got to keep it in schools. Yeah, there's a lot of talk about right now about like whether or not it should be taught in schools, and we think that it is foolish for it not to be taught in schools because there's so many important lessons in there.
Think
this
that
is very relatable.
Growing up can relate to this
and should read this book. All these characters have relatable aspects to them, and people should understand.
Everyone has a little bit of Holden in them.
You can
read this book, you realize how much you like Holden.
Like the things you want in life, such as relationships, maybe material things, maybe a place to live, just some money. Just really anything that he says, I'm sure people relate to in their own way. How he feels. Yeah, stuff like
everyone has that little bit of lone wolf aspect.
And with that, we think that everybody has seen a character mentioned in the book, in real life. So we're going to talk about those characters and what it means to be one of them.
That's just amazing. I love it.
Yeah, in some ways, I'm more proud of this one. This wasn't as structured. They wrote an outline and went outside and hit record on their phone and started talking about the book. And again, what you don't see is that I would say of those 4 kids, 3 of them have trouble passing classes in general. 2 have been suspended in the last month. I'm not sure how many would have written the paper, but they were excited and really stoked to go talk about it. And the podcast was kind of great. Later on, they're talking about Jane and somebody says we all have a Jane in our life, that girl that we can connect with, but we're afraid to talk to. And another guy jumps in and is like, go talk to that Jane. Everybody learn from Holden. Don't be a Holden. Go talk to Jane. And it was just fun to listen to and know that they know who Jane is. They got not just the character technically, but what it means to the book. And to talk to them afterwards about it, man, they were excited. It felt like what you were talking about with the driveway moment, but for speaking. that they got really engaged with their talks with each other, much more than they would have on a paper by themselves or even a shared doc.
Yeah, you can hear it in their voices.
Yeah, they said, like, you have to think faster. When they were in a discussion, the other two guys that did an interview process said we just weren't expecting the other person to say certain things, so we had to think fast and started saying things that we knew, but I don't know. They said that kind of engagement really helped their brain. They mentioned their brain a lot. They said my brain has to go. My brain has to be used. It can feel it.
Well, that is what all the research says, is that listening is a true brain workout. And when you're just focused on what are you going to say and not worried about, is there a camera or are you spelling this correctly? You can form, your brain is really active. So I'm afraid we're coming to the end of our time here, because I know, Mike, you and I could go on and share so many other great podcasts that we've helped students do. But you can learn more about what Mike's done from what you see on the screen. And we're also adding a lot of links and free podcasting guides that you're going to get in an email as well. So there's just so much more to explore, and what I just want to encourage you all to do is try something in your classroom. I mean, try just having them do a monologue into the phone first, or a conversation around a subject that they record and share with you. As you graduate up to trying to do a serial-like imitation podcast or an NPR style reporting story. So you can just start small and give it a try. And thank you all for joining us. And I know we have couple questions in the side box. I know we're a little over time, but I know we're being asked if there's a certificate for the webinar. We will get back to you on that. I believe we're putting one together. But I hope you found this webinar informative and insightful. We'll send out a PDF of this PowerPoint deck and a recording of the webinar in coming days, so you can share it. We encourage you to share it all widely. And you can contact me or Michael with other specific questions you may have about making podcasts in your classroom. And lastly, if you don't currently have ListenWise, a reminder, you can sign up for a free teacher account on our ListenWise page today. And if you have any additional questions, you can go to the Contact Us page. So, Mike, thank you so much for sharing everything.
Oh, yeah.
Appreciate it. And
thank you, yeah. I want everybody to send me podcasts, too, that they do.
Oh, yeah.
Good one.
Yeah, I bet many of our listeners now have done them, and I'd love to hear them too. So send them to me and Mike, because we love sharing. I love hearing what people are doing. Or try it, do it for the first time, and then send it. We'd love to.
Yeah, and ask questions. I answer everybody's email. So
great. All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a great day.